Hello, welcome back to the book log, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I'm gonna say off the top in this review that I'm going to be spoiling this book, which I always do, but it just feels particularly necessary to warn about that for this one. There are just some really basic plot elements that I think are better left unknown if you haven't read this book before, so just gonna say that now. If you haven't read this book and you intend to read it at some point, maybe just come back later. Okay, so anyway, just to get into the actual review here, I often see Never Let Me Go categorized as a sci-fi novel, and I suppose it technically is, but I don't think that label really captures how this book feels emotionally or atmospherically. It's very understated, it's very subdued, very toned down, and this is deliberately at odds with the direction this book ultimately goes in, which is some pretty absurd, even horrific sci-fi dystopia territory. But the thing about it is that none of the sci-fi or horror elements of the story are ever really reckoned with directly, and they're not the focal point of the story. Instead, those qualities lurk in the background, and I think that's part of why this book is so compelling. To be more direct about it, this is a story about clones who are deliberately bred for the purpose of having their organs harvested. On paper, this is a completely over-the-top, grotesque, almost sensational premise, but the effectiveness of this book lies in how this grim reality is painted only in the periphery. The characters in the story, those who are dealing with this, often reminisce throughout the book about how their reality was explained to them, but not really explained to them. And this book, as a narrative, operates in much the same way. Things are told to you, but not really. The awful, heavy truth of the purpose of these characters' lives is dealt with offhandedly, kind of on the edge of this book's focus. When you look at it head on, it's more of a coming-of-age character drama about childhood and growing up and memory and friendships, but the entire time, both you, the reader, and these characters are aware of their terrible, inevitable fate. This book is narrated in the first person by a character named Kathy H. She explains that she is currently a carer who works with donors before they complete, but initially none of these things are explained. Instead, she goes on to recount her childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood, beginning with her experiences as a student at Hailsham. Hailsham is essentially like a posh English boarding school where Kathy grows up, and the first act of this book is devoted to describing her life there. Ishiguro does a phenomenal job of portraying childhood and the way friendships during that time form in such arbitrary and unpredictable ways. Kathy describes how she meets her two best friends, Ruth and Tommy, who go on to become the other central characters in the story. Ruth is subtly controlling. She tends to exaggerate and embellish things in a slightly dishonest way, but it never really comes across as particularly malicious. Kathy and Ruth are just kids, and kids do that sort of thing. It reads as a very accurate depiction of the strange machinations of childhood relationships. Tommy, similarly, is prone to temper tantrums and acts immaturely at times, but the bond among the three of them is deeply genuine and very well rendered throughout the story. Speaking more generally, one thing that struck me about Ishiguro's writing is how good he is at capturing the subtle, invisible emotional undercurrents of things, like little flickers of doubt, the way people second guess a glance or a tone, or just kind of internally debate the meaning of a phrase. Just those small little internal negotiations we make without consciously noticing it. I saw someone say that he doesn't just write emotions or thoughts, he writes the shape of them, which I thought was a perfectly apt way to describe it. And as a result, these characters and the way they interact feel incredibly lifelike. Sometimes it felt like he was articulating a thought I'd had buried in my subconscious forever but never brought to the surface. And he manages to do all this with a prose style that's very blunt, very conversational, but very deceptively simple, which makes sense structurally, the entire story being this casual first-person narration from Kathy. There are a lot of strange and unsettling moments throughout the book, given its subject matter. Weird things teachers mention about how they're not going to have a future, or the fact that they're all forced to do artwork all the time that is then mysteriously brought to some unknown gallery for unknown reasons, or how none of them seem to have parents or families or last names. Very subtle hints of things being just south of normal, but again, almost never addressed directly. And that's not to say the characters aren't aware of their fates, but it kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier about being told but not really told. At one point, Kathy explains how their future as organ donors and the things that entails were revealed to them gradually at ages just young enough that they couldn't fully grasp it. So like they always had a vague understanding of their purpose, but never the clarity or authority to question it. Eventually, Kathy transitions her narrative into their lives after Hailsham at the cottages, and then beyond as carers and donors. The cottages serve as a sort of halfway point between Hailsham and the rest of their relatively short lives. They live there for a few years and just hang out essentially before becoming carers, which are basically personal aides who look after donors as they undergo their surgeries. Eventually, the carers themselves become donors, where they will give away their organs until they die, or as they call it, until they complete. It's interesting and also like heartbreaking to see them just live their lives as normal young adults despite the looming expectations of their future lives as donors. One of the more surreal threads during this period is the group's fascination with finding their possibles, which are the people they may have been cloned from. They don't know any details about these people, whether they were cloned as adults or as babies, but it's a frequent topic of conversation, and there's a whole scene where Ruth believes she's found the woman she's modeled after, and the group goes to observe her and follow her around. It's a very eerie scene, but it's also incredibly sad. The woman ends up not being Ruth's possible, but it still makes you think about how there's no difference between being an original copy or not. These doomed clones still have perfectly regular human souls. Another thing I thought was interesting is that despite knowing what's coming, despite all the little moments of doubt and confusion, none of them ever try to run away or rebel. They're constantly speculating and wondering and imagining about their lives, but it's always within the bounds of what they've been told is possible and what their purpose is. I think it's one of the more haunting, dark aspects of the story, just kind of like the quiet, resigned way they accept their fate, like the idea of defiance is just not available to them. I think in a lot of ways, their acceptance is supposed to mirror our own. We all live with the knowledge that our lives are finite, yet we go on forming relationships and making art and falling in love and planning for the future. The characters' resigned approach to their fate seems unsettling at first, but it also raises the question, like, how different are they really from us? If their existence is defined by a predetermined end, then so is ours. We live in the shadow of mortality just as much as they do, and if they, in spite of that, are still able to find meaning in the small moments and connections and memory, how is that any different from what we do? That reflection to me is what makes this book so effective and so beautiful. It's this grim dystopia, it's very tragic and sad, but it's also very real and human. It's just life. Mortality doesn't erase meaning, it creates it. And I think this book understands that. I really, really love the story. I'm going to give it a 9.